Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Happy to launch another session in this fascinating conference. I want to commend you, General Yadlin, for putting us up such a remarkable event. And we are hosting a panel about the new regional order, if there is such thing, trying to explore what is emerging out of the collapse of the old order in the Middle East. And with us is a very distinguished panel. I'll start with the ladies, of course, Dr. Benedetta Berti, a research fellow at the INSS, and Professor Galet Sabar, professor for African Studies at Tel-Aviv University. With us is Ambassador James Franklin Jeffrey, Philip Sondol's distinguished fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East. I hope I'll remember it right. Mr. Suat Kimikiloglu. All right, Kimikiloglu, Executive Director of the Center for Strategic Communications at Ankara, Dr. Kobi Michael, Senior Research Fellow at the INSS, and Mr. Vladimir van Wilgenburg, from the Middle East analyst and a freelance journalist specializing in Kurdistan. And perhaps we'll start with you, Ambassador, in an attempt to describe what it is that's coming out of the collapse of the old order in the region, as we see states that we've known for decades disappearing: Syria, Iraq, Libya, Yemen. Are there new borders? Is there a new order coming up? Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay. One of the charms of going late in the second day of any conference is that most of the causes of things have already been laid out, so I won't go into any detail on my views of what's been happening in this region for the last decade plus, but rather try to tackle quickly some of the ideas on how a new order could emerge. First of all, I will associate myself with Dave Petraeus yesterday when he talked about trying to do practical things rather than grand schemes. My country has approached the Middle East since 2000 with two grand schemes. One of the Bush administration was to push a radical democratization process with a great expansion of the use of military force, and then under the Obama administration to reach out to opponents with a almost equally radical diminution of the use of military force other than against terrorists. Whatever the pluses and minuses, and there were both in both administrations, no one can say that the region was more stable and less violent in 2008 than in 2000, or in 2016 than in 2008. So, so much for grand ideas. I would suggest 4 points to focus on trying to sort our way through this. The first one, while not a grand idea, does get to your question of order. There's no doubt that there are major challenges to the international order, not just here, although it's the focal point of it, but around the world. We heard a variant of this earlier today from Ambassador Schein when he talked about a polycentric system in a very approving way. Dori Gold had another approach where he, I think closer to my view, bewailed the fact that the international order is wavering. President Obama, who's usually among the more optimistic people on this theme, actually in the UN back in September talked about dangerous currents which risk pulling the world into a darker and more disorderly place. I think that's a very good summary of where we are. Again, nowhere more than here. The first thing we need is to recognize that this old order is under tremendous challenge. Secondly, there is no obvious replacement for it. So therefore, to the extent we can, let's give a try at trying to restore it. This means a couple of things. First of all, on the part of the United States, to recognize that this order that we literally take for granted in many respects is under assault, deliberate assault, from various quarters and from events in general. Secondly, to realize that at the center of this international order is security. At the center of security is the willingness of the United States and its partners to use military force, not little bits of military force with little risk, but if necessary, again, to quote President Obama from 2009 Oslo, with the force of our arms and the blood of our citizens to help preserve the international order. If we're not ready to do that, this order is going, and I don't see what's going to replace it. We also need help from our allies and friends. That is, we need you all to support this international order. Now, support is an easy word to throw out at these conferences. It's a cuddly, warm word and means nothing. So I'll try to define it. Support means doing hard things, doing things you don't want to do for the greater good of a system, and avoiding doing things that undercut it. Don't shoot down Russian fighter planes. Don't invade Yemen. Don't sit out an important vote on basic international law involving Ukraine in the United Nations. There are reasons in all cases for countries in question to have done this, and some of it might be some doubt about our ability as a security provider, but nonetheless, this requires everybody to pitch in. What does this order look like? Kind of like the old order. Nation states are at the center of things, however weak they are in this region and elsewhere. Secondly, borders matter. They matter here. They matter in Iraq. They matter in other places. However badly they were drawn, they're what we have. And basic principles where we look at values and not ethnic groups. In this region, particularly not the split between Sunni and Shia, are very vital. Beyond that, just a couple of things. The biggest challenge in the region is this growing Iranian, Syrian, Russian, Hezbollah alliance of sorts. It appears to be the nightmare that King Abdullah a decade ago talked about with the Shia Crescent. It's not an ally against ISIS. It will drive much of the region into the arms of ISIS, I fear, if it isn't combated. And by combating, I don't mean directly or openly. I mean simply ensure that there is a compromise solution, a real compromise solution in Syria. If that doesn't happen, this region will go way out of control. Secondly, Daesh has to be fought, and fought now. We have to find a way, we being all of us, to go on the offensive. That's going to require more effort from everybody, beginning with the United States. Finally, don't wait on points 1, 2, and 3 until somebody can come up with a final comprehensive solution to everything that's wrong in the region. I've been on the ground trying to do that in various countries in the region. People here have been trying to fix problems between Israelis and Palestinians, development in Gaza, and on and on and on for a long time. Nobody has a long-term approach to this or almost any other region, and if we wait to get those answers right before we act against the immediate problems, things are going to just keep on going downhill. Thank you.
Thank you. From the perspective here, it seems that your administration is quite comfortable with this new alliance that we're seeing. But before we dive into that, I want to address Dr. Berti and talk about the non-state actors. I mean, for a lifetime almost, we have learned names like Gaddafi, Mubarak, Saddam, Assad, and suddenly we are all struggling to learn new names. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, Jolani, the new leaders of the region. How are the non-state actors trying to create their own order?
Well, let's start with the end. And the end is that we will have to learn more and more names of non-state actors. There's no way around this. If we want to start with the beginning, the relationship between failed, fragile, weak states in the region and non-state actors is one of mutual reinforcement. This is for a very simple reason. If you think about a state that is weak, a state with poor law enforcement, a state with porous borders, well, that's a great operational environment for a non-state armed group, a militia, an insurgent, a terrorist group, a criminal organization. It makes it easier for these groups to move around. It makes it easier to acquire weapons. It makes it easier to be involved in criminal activities. And of course, it makes it easier to establish a safe haven, a territorial base from which to strengthen themselves, to think about strategy, and to move forward. But to me, that's the least interesting part of the question, meaning, to me, it's much less interesting to see how rebel groups are exploiting the vacuum. And what I think we need to understand more, and what's changing the rules of the game, is that non-state armed groups are filling that vacuum. They're not just exploiting it. And I'm going to be a contrarian here, because for the past day and a half, I keep hearing about there's no order, there's disorder, there's chaos. That is a 360 view. This is an aerial view. If you see it from up above, that's how it looks like. But the more you go on the ground and you look at a community by community way, the more you see that there's no such thing as vacuum. Vacuums are filled. And that the absence of a central government doesn't mean the absence of governance. When the state is absent, when the state is not there, when the state is not able or willing to provide, someone else will. And in this part of the world, we have more and more rebel groups that are stepping in to fill up this vacuum and to give themselves what states are not given. And you know, it can be at the very basic, it's security and protection. Then it becomes setting up a system of justice. Then it becomes creating a welfare system. And this changes the game, because you have a non-state group, a rebel group, think Hezbollah, think Hamas, or think the Islamic State. They diversify the way they found themselves. They can rely on taxation. They have a stronger bond with the population. They are more resilient. And the more this develops, the more we really have to fundamentally rethink our binary view of the world between states and non-states. How do we call an actor like the Islamic State today? And why do we relate to it and think about long-term policies with respect to it as a non-state actor? It doesn't really work. So yes, we need to learn more names of al-Baghdadi and rebel leaders. We need to see that today the international order is not longer just about states. And to say one more thing before I give up the microphone, this changes the rules of the game. It changes the laws of war, more and more between states and non-state actors, and it changes the rule of peacemaking. It changes the way we think about governance, the way we think about democracy, the way we think about development. For example, most of our templates want to strengthen governance by strengthening the central state. Sometimes that's good, but I work on the field a lot, and I see sometimes that doesn't work. Sometimes you have to work with the local actors. And that's a discussion that it's central, I think, because working with the most effective partner sometimes means weakening the central state. And are we really ready for that? Are we ready to pay the price in terms of undermining the Westphalian order? Maybe yes, maybe no, but we need to understand that what we're dealing with today is breakdown of central sovereignty, rise of challengers, and thinking in this dichotomy, state or non-state, and whatever is not a state is chaos, I don't think it helps us understand the region at all.
But behind all these changes, Professor Sabah, we see a massive humanitarian crisis, which is discussed in conferences like this and sometimes reaches the threshold of the media, but eventually it doesn't seem to affect policy at the end of the day.
I think that what we're seeing now is an immense change, even in the way that we look at the humanitarian crisis. It's no longer an issue, an esoteric issue of a few 100,000 asylum seekers in this country or a few thousand of asylum seekers in that country. It seems that what's happening in the past 5 years is really the realization that we've got millions and millions of people who are seeking asylum. They're no longer these unable, poor refugees, but they're subjects of their own faith. They're taking their destiny in their own hands, and they're demanding the international community to be there, to take responsibility either for neglecting areas of conflict for a long time or instigating conflict in other places. So in other words, what we are seeing now is the refugees themselves, millions and millions of men, women, and children, are literally with their own bodies coming and claiming their rights for peace, for security, and also demanding the entire community to stop neglecting it and just putting it under the rubric of humanitarian aid. What they're saying is that it is part of international relationship. It's part of decision-making. We can no longer leave it to aid organization. It has to be a global way of looking at it because it's an economic issue, it's a security-related issue. Refugees can no longer be remained in this very peripheral way that we kept looking. I think it really challenges the orders of the world, the borders between states, and also I think that the refugees themselves make the link between decision-making in the global economic center and the periphery, or what we refer to as the periphery.
Thank you. And out of the sinking of the Arab world into this weakness and this pool of blood and violence, Mr. Kenikiloglu, we see the emergence of the non-Arab states as setting the agenda for the region, Turkey and Iran. How does the competition between those two playing within the region?
Well, let me, if you allow me, to go back to the original question to what the doctor from INSS said. I actually agree with her more that the nation state is really in a crisis, that we will probably see more challenges and if potentially breakups of nation states in the future. I think we will see smaller political units, more difficult to rein in, to talk to.
Well, there are very few genuine nation states in the region.
There are, but I think I'm more on the pessimistic side that the nation state will not be able to hold, not all of them, of course, but we will see breakups, smaller political units, potentially more violence and confrontation. Until a new equilibrium will be established in these domestic settings. And I think I agree with her that we need to get used to about these non-state actors at the moment as actors, whether we like them or not, who control territory, as IS and others are. I think coming to your question, I think this has been long a reality of the region, that non-Arab states have played critical roles, both in the Cold War but also now. And therefore, I'm very much in favor of Turkish-Israeli normalization as we had in the past. These two non-Arab states continue to patch up and work together, because the challenges that are emanating from Syria, from Iraq, and overall, it's not only Syria and Iraq, from overall, necessitate our countries to work together, who already have a history and tradition of working together.
I think many Israelis are puzzled by what is the Turkish interest vis-a-vis what's going on in Syria. On one hand, taking attacks from ISIS in Istanbul, and on the other hand, allowing volunteers to join ISIS through the border.
Well, let me underline, I don't speak on behalf of the government or subscribe to it. But to describe the view of Ankara, it's very much embedded in the personal confrontation between Assad and Erdogan himself. I think President Erdogan saw in the Arab awakening not Arab populations rising against dictators, but he saw the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood in the region. And I think he thought that he would be leading that Muslim Brotherhood-dominated Arab world. I think that's what he had in mind. Of course, by the end of 2012, it became clear that in Syria, the transition or the revolution was not going to take place as it did quickly in Tunisia, in Libya, or in Egypt. So unfortunately, Turkey is now dragged into this conflict and invested so much that even if it would wanted to disengage, it will be extremely difficult. Those who know my writing, I don't agree with this policy at all, but I think President Erdogan is still keen today on regime change in Syria. And he believes that the violence, IS, are all outcomes of the primary problem, which is the Assad regime.
So let's talk for a second about perhaps the largest stateless ethnic group in the Middle East, which are the Kurds. And Mr. van Wilgenburg, you live in Kurdistan most of your time. We had a chance, I think, in the last few weeks to meet some Kurdish delegators to Israel. And some of them said that they are reading the writing of Ben Gurion, pondering what is a good time to declare a state. Are there any close to such a measure?
Maybe we can show the map. But of course, the Kurds are benefiting from the breakdown of the Sykes-Picot borders. For instance, the Kurdish president Barzani now said that the borders are now again drawn in blood. And that's what we are now seeing not only in Iraq, but also in northern Syria, because if you look to that yellow strip, that's now all the area that the Kurds now control. In the past, the Kurds didn't benefit from the destruction of the Ottoman Empire. They didn't end up with a state, but it seems now more and more that at least maybe it will not lead to an independent Kurdish state in Iraq, but at least independent statelets, both in northern Syria and both in northern Iraq. The Kurdish president Barzani has talked about independence several times. He has talked about this in 2012 when there was a crisis with Baghdad. He has talked about that in 2014 in July when ISIS took Mosul and the Kurdish Peshmerga forces secured most of the territories after the Iraqi army fled. And now again, when we are getting close to the defeat of the Islamic State in Iraq, many people here don't seem to believe that, but I share this opinion that it is a possibility that ISIS could be defeated in 2016, at least in Iraq. Barzani is again talking about the possibility of an independent Kurdish state. Of course, it's quite difficult because for a state you need a sort of form of, you have to control your territories and your borders. As an ethnic group, you have to have stable institutions, a good functioning army, and most of all, which is very important for the Kurds, is international recognition.
And national integrity.
Yeah, and of course, one of the biggest problems the Kurds have is that they are landlocked. They are surrounded by Iran, Turkey, Syria, and Iraq, and all of those states have an interest of basically not having a Kurdish state. They don't want this. So what Barzani did is sort of the Barzani model is trying to export oil and gas to Turkey and try to convince Turkey in an economic way to support him in Kurdish independence. And now, of course, if you've seen recently, Turkish tanks have appeared close to Mosul, and there's a lot of tensions between Baghdad and the Kurds. And this is also, again, related to this sort of Safavid-Ottoman competition which is coming back up, with Erdogan having Ottoman ambitions and the Iranian state having Safavid ambitions, so the export of the Islamic Revolution in countries like Yemen and Syria and other countries. So the Kurds are somehow benefiting from this, and what Barzani hopes is that those Iranian-Saudi tensions could, for instance, lead Gulf Arab countries and Turkey to support Iraqi Kurds to have independence, because the Kurdish state in Iraq could possibly be a partner, a secular partner against Iranian ambitions in Iraq. Of course, the United States sees this differently and still supports the one Iraq policy, but Barzani hopes that the competition between the Shia blocs and the Sunni countries could lead more support for the Iraqi Kurds. But then again, there's also internal problems because the Iraqi Kurds have been over-reliant on oil. Now ISIS is close to defeat in Iraq, but now the oil prices are almost down to zero, and it's very difficult now for the Kurds to have a good economy while their whole economy is based on oil. And also they are suffering from internal disunity between the Kurdish parties, and they also have an economy now which is quite weak. So they could actually learn from Israel in a way is that Israel has built non-partisan institutions like a functioning army. They could also learn from the Israelis, for instance, in the term of transparency and anti-corruption measures. But the problem is the oil money has created sort of dysfunctional elite which is profiting from the oil resources. So the Iraqi Kurds have to solve the political disunity, they have to solve their economical problems. But first of all, the most important thing for the Kurds is international recognition, because you can have your independent state, but if you're recognized by no one and you're landlocked, you have no way out. So that's why if they don't have recognition, they could be ending up like Turkish Cyprus, which I think is maybe only recognized by Turkey in some countries, and it's very isolated. So they don't want to end up like, for instance, Cyprus. But it's possible that in 2016 we could see a Kurdish independent state. It's possible because in this climate you cannot predict anything. But it's also the Kurds still have a lot of challenges to achieve this.
But
Thank you.
I have to say that the view from here, Dr. Michael, I think that many Israelis were looking at the American effort to bring Turkey on board on what is on the so-called anti-ISIS coalition was made in the price of sacrificing the Kurds. I mean, it seems to me that Turkey got a license to continue striking the Kurds and prevent territorial integrity in the price of them joining the coalition. Do they stand a chance of creating a viable state?
I think that eventually we are in a sort of a transitional process which is a very bleeding one. And I'm not sure that in a sense we are not captured in a very old and irrelevant conceptual system when we are trying to interpret or to understand the current situation by using some old terms which are taken from the old order, from the Westphalian order, from the state order, from the idea of sovereignty and etc. And therefore there is a sense of a huge mess which is very cloudy and misunderstood. And I think that it is not understood not only by the Americans or by the coalition, but also by the local actors. And I think that what we see is sort of an evolutionary process in where, and this is a sort of continuation to the things that have been said by Dr. Bertie, about the new political composition of the region. And actually I think that along the axis of time, we are going to see new political entities here. And I think that in this regard, and going back to your question, this is the great challenge for the Americans as the main leaders, but for the other partners in the coalition as well, to understand what is going to be the essence and the character of the future political entities here in the region. And I think that there are some terms or concepts which are pretty familiar to us, like federation, okay, autonomy, and state, that might be used in order to begin the interpretation of the new developments, but we have to be aware that that there is a need for new concepts in order to interpret, in order to understand the new development and the essence of the new political entities, because it is going to be something like a federation, but not a federation in the sense that we know. And I think that we can see the beginning of this development, for an example, in Iraq with Kurdistan, which is something in between, okay? It's something which is more than autonomy, but less than a state. It's something that, in a sense, might be related to the future Iraqi state, but with a very weak central federal governance or something like that. And I think that something like that will be in Libya, in a sort of maybe an agreement between tribes, maybe in Yemen. But just in order to conclude, I think that we have to release ourselves from the idea of conflict resolution, okay, in the sense that each conflict can be resolved. And I think that it will be much more beneficial for us to adopt the term of political arrangements, okay, because I'm not sure that the conflicts are going to be resolved in the coming future, but they might be arranged on the basis of a different political order in a sense that it will be less bleeding.
I want to spend a couple of more minutes understanding the American position with you, Ambassador Jeffrey. I mean, you served in Ankara. Turkey, a NATO member, is buying oil from ISIS, is being the port for volunteers joining ISIS. Can you understand what is the current American policy vis-a-vis Turkey and the fight against ISIS?
Yeah, I wouldn't put it in those terms. Turkey as a state isn't buying oil from ISIS. People in Turkey ever since I was first there in the early 80s, buy oil and other product from anybody who trucks it across the border, and they don't ask where it's come from or look for papers, and that's continuing. Could the Turkish government stop that? We were pushing them for many years when it was Saddam's oil, and we didn't succeed. Turkey is an important ally in the fight against Daesh. There's no doubt about that. There's also no doubt that Turkey thinks, and I happen to think it's right, that the bigger threat to Turkey is this alliance of Syria, Iran, Russia, Hezbollah, and possibly at least the PYD slice of the Kurds. And unless the United States does not do more than we're now doing on that front, Turkey is basically in a quid pro quo situation, saying you'll get only limited support from us for the fight against Daesh. The other thing is, it isn't apples and oranges. If you close the border entirely to Daesh along the Turkish border, you also close it to all of the other jihadist and opposition groups that Turkey is supporting. These people don't get cards issued by the resistance groups. It's hard to tell who they are. They're from Morocco, they're from Libya, they're from Yemen, who knows. And it's in the Turks' interest to keep most of those groups well supplied and moving back and forth across the border. So it's terribly complex, and I think that this is a dynamic relationship between the U.S. and Turkey, but again, we won't get a whole lot more out of Turkey unless Turkey sees more from us on the Syrian front.
Dr. Berti, we've heard yesterday here from the Chief of Staff a forecast that the war in Syria may continue for many years. Would you accept the notion that neither of the belligerent sides is strong enough to win, but all of them are strong enough not to lose?
I think that's a good assessment. I think if we go back to when this all began, and it began as a political, mostly nonviolent revolution, and it quickly turned into a militarized conflict with themes that from political quickly became sectarian. And when that happened, we started to see the emergence of this mutually hurtling stalemate by which the main warring parties really do feel, like you're saying, they do really feel as facing existential threats. So they feel if the adversary wins, they're not just themselves and what they represent, but their own communities are going to face an existential threat. So that creates a very strong incentive to continue the war. I would say that the assessment that they're all weakening and they are all bleeding, but not enough to agree to a peace deal, I think that's correct, but it's not just because of the dynamics going on in Syria, it's also because this has become, for all intents and purposes, a regional proxy warfare. And we cannot understand the lack of political compromise if we don't see it through the lens of the Iranian-Saudi rivalry, and the fact that Syria is a pawn, and they're ready to really fight until the last the last drop of Syrian blood, I would say. So that makes me think that the chances for a immediate or even upcoming political resolution are still very far away until not just the parties on the ground, but also Turkey, but also Iran, but also Saudi Arabia all agree to a political settlement that ultimately is going to make everybody unhappy, but may allow them to save face enough so that we can move from war making to peace building. But we're not there yet.
So let's talk for a second about the Israeli interest, Dr. Michael. You know, there's an ongoing discussion, especially in the defense and intelligence community. Where should Israel stand vis-a-vis this war? I mean, some would say Israel needs to pull out that critical link of Assad out of the Shiite axis, and some would say, you know, let them bleed. This is none of our business. We should watch them and see what happens. How would you define the Israeli interest? Is it like, you know, if, the late Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir said during the Iran-Iraq war, I wish luck to all parties?
Actually, this is a question that was asked just yesterday, and I think that Amos has related to this question in a very broad manner. But I would say that, generally speaking, I think that Israel has to seek for opportunities and to understand that there is not such a thing like status quo. And Israel has to define its interest, its strategic interest, and to look for the potential partners in the theater, in the arena, and I think that there are some potential partners. It will not be so easy, first of all, to recognize or to define them, and then it will not be so easy to engage with them without paying a sort of a price, because by engaging with partners, you are going to conflict with some other partners as well. And here you have to create a very delicate balance, a very delicate strategic balance. But generally speaking, I think that maybe it's a ripe moment for Israel to look for the relevant partners in the Syrian theater, and to find a way to establish some strategic relations that will enable them, those partners in a sense, to establish a sort of political and military position in the Syrian arena, in a sense that will bring in their calculation the Israeli strategic interest as well. But the implementation of such a recommendation, I would say, is a very complicated and sensitive one.
Well, natural partners would be the Kurds, with which we have a sort of an alliance for almost 60 years. Is there an expectation among the Kurds to see more Israeli assistance to help them establish their own state?
Well, that's a very difficult question for the Kurds, because they are surrounded by countries that are quite hostile towards Israel, and they're landlocked, so they don't have the same opportunity that Israel have, that they have access to the sea. So there was the first time when the Kurds were talking about independence was in 2012, but when the Kurds were talking about independence in 2014, I think it was first the Israeli president that told the US president that he would support Kurdish independence. But the problem for the Kurds is that one of their big neighbors is Iran, another big neighbor is Turkey. So for for the Kurds, it's much more important to get support from this sort of new bloc which is forming, which is the bloc between the Sunni Gulf countries and Turkey, which are competing with the Shia militias and Iran. So it's much more important for the Kurds to get support from the Sunni Arabs rather than Israel, because Israel is very far away, and what can Israel do is mostly limited to recognition. But of course, in general, most Iraqi Kurds at least are quite in favor of Israel, and they see it often as a model. But if you look to the Kurdish leadership, they are very cautious with acknowledging any Israeli relation or anything, and also the Israeli government is very careful in this. But you also see this, for instance, that when Barzani was asked, do you want to have an Israeli consulate or embassy in the Kurdish region, he said, if Baghdad opens one, then we will do it. But what you now see, for instance, the oil exports, they go first to Turkey, and actually some of this oil is now being sold to, I think, Israeli companies, and it's shipped off, I think, in Haifa. So there's some form of indirect Israeli support, but it's very difficult for the Kurds being surrounded also by ISIS, because ISIS and also Al-Qaeda in the past, they have always said that the Iraqi Kurdish leadership is working with a Zionist US alliance. And if they really obviously work now with Israel, it will also result into many problems in Iran, because you have the fall of Saddam has unleashed the Shia militias, and also now the rise of ISIS. And we haven't talked a lot about that, but the Shia militias are very hostile towards Israel, both in Iraq, in Yemen, in Syria, and Lebanon. And if the Kurds work together with Israel, it will make them an even bigger target, for instance, for the Shia militias in Iraq. And there already have been a lot of clashes close to the Iranian border in some of those disputed territories. In, for instance, the city of Tushkurmato, where there has been clashes between Shia militias and Kurdish Peshmerga forces. So the Kurds are in a very volatile region, and it's very difficult for them to take very clear positions.
But if we will see a very likely scenario of Syria and Iraq disintegrating into several political units, is this something that the Turks can live with? Would they accept new political entities south of them in the east?
I agree with you on Syria. I'm more skeptical about the disintegration of Iraq. But I think what we need to figure in here, we are talking on the assumption of the last 8 years of an Obama administration and that type of US leadership. We might have very a different approach from Washington into the region. And I think no one talked about Russia here, but we have here, you have the Russians on the ground in Syria, in the air, and it appears until the end of the Obama administration, Russia will continue to have air superiority in the Syrian airspace. While we have all these pessimistic assumptions, and there are a lot of reasons to do that, we should not rule out strong US leadership coming back into the region that could, A, have a discussion with the Russians, B, would be much more forceful in whatever order will emerge in the region. Now, I think on Syria, many people, including in Ankara, people recognize it will be very difficult to patch that country back. And even if it would be patched back, if we would see on a map Syria as we see it today, it will be a very different country, probably with autonomous federalism, whatever. Iraq, I think, still has the capacity, despite Kurdish aspirations, I think Iraq still has the capacity to stay together because I believe the United States still carries a sense of responsibility for what happened for a long time, so that they actually have an interest in maintaining it in terms of credibility. But I think we had yesterday at INSS very interesting discussions, and I subscribe with Francois Heisbourg's interpretation that we are entering into the 30 years wars in the Middle East. It's very difficult to predict. And if you read the 30-year wars in Europe, powers who were strong at the beginning came out diminished. There were new powers emerging. So I think we should not rule out, and no one, including the United States, I think, is in the position to predict what kind of order or what kind of balance will be established. But I don't think countries like Saudi Arabia are entities as strong as they look from the outside. Yes, indeed, Iraq could disintegrate. These are possibilities. But I think what we have to brace ourselves for is we should prepare ourselves to see non-state actors as interlocutors in the region that we will have to deal with. And I'm not talking about IS here, but others who may have not international recognition, but who control territory and who have perhaps not democracies, but places that they run and administer. But I think the intellectual challenge, because we are all used to think in terms of nation states as legitimate political units, but I think we are entering in an era, be it on ethnicity, sects, or pure political alliances, where we will see de facto entities we would not be able to recognize in the thinking that we are seeing today. And I think this is a challenge for all of us, but as I said, we have a strong US presidency who would take leadership and has a certain vision. Many of these more negative scenarios probably could be somewhat limited and steered in a direction that is not as pessimistic that I think it might be.
Well, that's also questionable, but you're right. We ignore the Russian element, and you, Ambassador, in our previous discussion before entering here, didn't seem to be too impressed by the Russian presence and its significance in Syria.
No, quite to the contrary. I'm very impressed. Mr. Putin, with 30 fighter planes, is redrawing a good bit of the Middle East. Turkey has 200. We have somewhere between 200 and 250 in the region. Egypt, another 300. How many fighter planes does Israel have? Jordan, Saudi Arabia. I rest my case. This is what Putin is doing with 30. And again, one correction, it isn't that he has air supremacy in Syria, he has air sovereignty because we're willing to give it to him. And finally, I'll defend President Obama. He is a very strong president and he has a vision. It's not a vision I support, but he knows where he wants to go. It just may not be compatible with where the Middle East is going.
So, Professor Sabah, what would be your recommendations if you asked to the person entering the White House in January 17, and based on your experience of the African case, for example?
Well, first of all, I'll start by saying that I hope it would be a lady entering into the White House. And I think that this would bring me and connect me to one of my strongest recommendations, and that is that in any and every discussion, think tank, policy making, decision making, research papers, etc., I think that the gender issue has to be brought in. 52% of the world, both those who are leading and suffering, both those who are victims and those who victimize, women are involved in that. But we don't see enough of a gender-related perspective. So it's not just that Hillary Clinton is a woman that she will change it, but it's truly a very, very different approach to various issues, economic, political, humanitarian crisis. So I think that that is the first thing that has to be said. And maybe, you know, after so many years that the world has been run by one gender in a very specific way, maybe it's a time for women to be more involved, and maybe we would see a change in the future. So that is probably the first recommendation. I hope that some men have also clapped, because each and every man has a wife, a mother, and daughters. So it's really an issue of all of us. It's not just a feminist issue. It's truly a humanitarian and humanistic new approach. So that would be the first thing. And the second thing, which I think relates to it, is that we have to bring to the table of discussion the voices of the people that we're speaking about. I mean, people from those areas where the war is, the conflict is, whether they are Afghan or Pakistan or Syrian or people from the African continent, they have to have their voice and their different perspective on conflict resolution, on state-orchestrated organs and the way they work. You know, even if we look at the African history, the nation-state was forcefully enforced by colonialism. And what we really see now is that a lot of the African unions, the African units are going back to pre-colonial time and building new alliances that are not the same as the Western idea of the nation state. So also maybe from there, from what we relate as the periphery, some new and fresh ideas would be seen. And the last is, and I'm going back to what I started with, it's our responsibility as a global human world. It's not Turkey's problem, it's not the Syrian problem, it's not the Americans they have to do all, you know, and create a coalition. It really has to be a much more global effort to try and change things.
And also you said not North-South division.
Yes, I think that that relates to it. I think that this division of North-South is no longer relevant. The idea that the North is developed and democratic and knows where it's going to, and the South is underdeveloped and dependent, I think it's truly no longer. I think that the involvement of China breaks this, and definitely the involvement of China in the African continent. So we really have to think in different terms.
Dr. Bertie, you wanted to add?
I did. First of all, I couldn't agree more, but I think just to develop that point even further, when we think only in terms of the old rules of the games, and when we think only in terms of state versus state dynamics, and we only look at a state as threats, we just don't miss the voices of women and the voices of the communities on the ground. We also miss a great deal of reality. For example, I've been here for a day and a half, and I've heard a lot of really interesting insights, but to me it is quite puzzling that we're looking and talking about the future of the Middle East and what will happen in 20 to 30 years, and we don't talk about the fact that there is one of the greatest humanitarian crises since World War II happening on our footsteps in Syria. It involves more than 4 million people that have become refugees. It involves more than 6 million people who have lost their homes in the country, and this is not just a humanitarian issue that we should leave to the end of the conference where the good people come out. This is going to determine the demographic, the political, the economic, and the social dynamics of the Middle East. And it has nothing to do with Iranian hegemony or Syrian breaking down. It has to do with the fact that a great deal of human potential is being lost. It has to do with the fact that we have 5 million children out of school for 2 years. It has to do with a lost generation. And it has to do with the fact that at least we switch our order of priority and see this as a key, not just development, not just humanitarian, but strategic issue. We're not going to really be able to revert the trends and ultimately have a positive impact on reality. And just to explain what I mean, one of the greatest crises since World War II, in Syria and in 3 countries in the region, which we haven't mentioned enough, Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey, they are trying to deal with it with limited resources. The international community is only be able to provide half of what they need because the money is just not enough at the moment. And we have one big risk, and I think it relates to anybody who worries about radicalization, anybody who worries about ISIS. We have the risk of a new class of second-class citizens rising across the Middle East with limited rights, limited opportunities to participate, limited opportunities to develop and to develop their human potential. And that's a major magnet for radicalization, is a major magnet for recruiting into criminal organizations, into armed groups. So when we go back to this war that's just state-centered, just about military power, just about military force, we really miss the picture. We miss big trends. I mean, in 20 years, when we have the rise of the new ISIS, then we'll have a discussion as to why 20 years before we didn't think about long-term integration and we didn't think about dealing with the refugee crisis. So to me, that's very related to, well, everything that's been said so far about listening to the voices of women and the voices of the community, but not because it's nice, but because otherwise we don't get it.
Perhaps it's because the whole definition of a refugee was abused for so many years, distorted. We have in the West Bank and Gaza 5th-generation refugees living, certified by the UN, living in the same building of their family for 5 generations. And suddenly, we come across genuine refugees. Professor Sabah?
Well, I would not go into the Palestinian refugee issue. I think that would
No,
complicate.
I'm talking about the global definition.
Yeah, but I do agree with you that we have to change the way that we see refugees today. It's no longer those only those children in refugee camps. It's refugees or asylum seekers that know that they want a different place to live, that they know that they want a different future for their children, and they're willing to fight for that. And they're willing to take the risk and cross the Mediterranean in those ships and risk their lives just for the sake of maybe having a better future. So we're really facing a completely different trend or wave of migration. And I want to say something that it might be obvious, but migration is here and it's here to stay. And we have to deal with it. We can build these huge fences and create these huge mechanisms of stopping them. But once the push and pull factors are still extremely there and very, very strong, it's going to be here. So let's look at the opportunities that this migration is bringing rather than only looking at it as challenges and obstacles and a threat. You know, we really have to strengthen the moderate, those voices and people that want a better life, and to relate to them and not just to the other side of the refugee story.
Clearly, we've touched a nerve here because you all wanted to comment, starting with Dr. Michael.
Just a short comment that I think the last discussion here reflects in a sense, and this is the idea of the ethnocentric approach, which is pretty there with regard to all we used to know as state building or nation building in the old terms, operations and peacekeeping operations and etc. When the Western community or the northern states came to assist and to help the failed states, okay? And they brought with them their set of values, their set of concepts, their ideas, and actually they have tried to force or to impose their political thoughts, their ideas, their virtues and norms on the local communities, and this actually was a huge mistake. On the other hand, I think that we have to be very cautious, okay, when we deal with the current challenges and the current problems with the same values, okay, that we bring to the arena as Western societies, when we think that these are really noble, and in our eyes these are really noble values, okay, but I'm not sure that the local political culture or the local societies perceive it necessarily in the very same way. And we have to be very sensitive in this regard. And talking about the local power or the bottom-up processes, we have to be aware to the local values and to the local political culture, and to be aware and to avoid from a sort of ethnocentric bias, trying to impose our values and our ideas on these local societies. And we have to understand that they are, in a sense, different, and they have maybe different values, and we have to respect these different values.
So what?
I criticize my government on many issues when it comes to the Middle East, but one thing that needs to be recognized is the 3 million refugees that Turkey absorbed, and very much most of the cost of that has been out of the Turkish budget. The better news are that now, with the agreement with the European Union, just this week the refugees have been started to issue work permits, which was a great problem, and most of those who were leaving Turkey to Europe were complaining that they liked Turkey, the environment was hospitable, but with no work permits that they had to leave. So I think that will be something that is welcomed. There's no doubt it puts pressure on society, especially the southern provinces, and in the big cities you see the tension between urban Turks and refugees. But I think most Turks have come to recognize that this is a phenomenon to stay, and the extension of work permits is no doubt going to ease the integration of the Syrian population.
Go ahead, Ambassador.
Yeah, right after I, at the beginning of our chat, put weight on the nation state as an organizing principle of a new order. The other members of the panel have spent a fair amount of the last 50 minutes trashing the nation state, absolutely correctly, talking about communities, various groups within them, subnational states, including my all-time favorite, the Kurdistan Regional Government. But here's the problem. A lot of the problems that we and they have been discussing, such as the refugee problem in Syria, arise from violence. Some of it is state violence, some of it with ISIS is non-state or quasi-state violence, some of it is violence from groups, and other major changes. The only entities in the world, not only legally but in terms of mobilizing popular sentiment in a very massive, coordinated way to deal with these things, including bringing violence to bear on these problems, are nation states. And nation states are pretty resilient. Sure, we had the 30 Years' War and 2 new nation states appeared, Switzerland and the Netherlands, but by and large, Europe remained pretty much the same set of nation states with borders changed. Poland disappeared, but by and large, it stayed pretty much the same. So nation states are here, and it's hard to tear them apart. And when you do, even Yugoslavia, under far better circumstances, both locally and in terms of the global situation 20 years ago than now, look what that did to Europe and the world. And the situation here will be much worse.
And the Kurds, after achieving perhaps the most significant wins in combat against ISIS, where will we find them next year? Progressing, pushing ISIS south?
I think we don't have to. The Kurds already almost defeated ISIS because they now control 95% of the territory that they want. So the rest of the job has to be done by the Iraqi government. And in Syria, the problem is that there's, if you look at the map, there's like this small black strip there. And Turkey doesn't want this border strip to be controlled by the Kurds. Assad and Russia would love that to control by the Kurds, because then you break the rebel supply lines. And US is in between, and they want to get rid of ISIS there, but they also have to deal with Turkey. So in northern Syria, the situation is very complicated, probably too complicated to explain very easily here. But what I wanted to say about the leadership of the US in the region, what we've seen now that without a real US leadership in the region, you see that the local regional superpowers are trying to play their role, and it's not a good role, because now we see more sectarianism, we see the beast of Shia militias, Sunni jihadism, and this is what you get as an outcome of no US leadership in the region, and it's going to get much more worse if we don't stop it now. Because if you look now with the Hashid Shabi, ISIS, Nusra, Ahrar Sham, Jaish, it's all Islamic groups, and the only superpowers can stop this sectarianism from spreading. But if you leave it just to the locals and let them solve them out their own problems, then we have a religious war in the region, and that's a big problem. And also I would like to say something about the gender issues, that we should focus on gender. But if you now see the most people who are dying in these wars, they're all men. And apart from a few areas, like for instance Israel, where you have females in the army, and the Kurds that have females fighting actively in the war, and the Kurds have female leadership, there's a very marginalized role for women. And that's not the responsibility of the West. That's the responsibility of Saudi Arabia, that's the responsibility of Iran, the responsibility of Turkey, and it's the responsibility of all those Muslim states that don't give women a voice in politics. It has nothing to do with the West. And if we have all the immigrants coming from Muslim countries to Europe, they will also export these kind of ideas to Europe. And then we have another issue in Europe. So also, Europe cannot take the responsibility for all the refugees, because a lot of these Muslim refugees, they can be better integrated in countries like in the Gulf states. But the Gulf states, they don't accept refugees. So we should praise Turkey at least for trying to do something about it, and especially also Lebanon, because that's often forget they have a huge refugee influx. And also in Iraq, there's an internally displaced. So for instance, in the Iraqi Kurdistan region, although some people say they are discriminating Arabs, everywhere there are Sunni Arabs coming from Mosul, from Anbar, from the Sunni Arabs. For instance, you have one town called Shaklawa. It's now called Shakaluja because there's so many Sunni Arabs. So the Iraqi Kurdish region, although they have almost no budget and they're not the state, they're dealing with over 1 to 2 million displaced people. So it's not only about refugees, it's also about internally displaced people inside Syria, inside Iraq. So we also should focus on the IDPs in this region. Yeah.
You know, yesterday the Israeli chief of staff was on this stage admitting that the Israeli intelligence only started looking at ISIS somewhere in 2014. And I recall the briefing that we had with the chief of intelligence in June 2014, a day before ISIS took over Mosul, and the word ISIS was never mentioned at an intelligence briefing. Will we see those forces that we all discussed throughout the hour continue to dominate the region in the next year, or there will be new phenomena emerging out of this region that we are not aware of today? This is an open question to any of you.
As I said before, I think that we are facing a transitional process that will be a long one, a very long one. I think that we have to think in terms of decades, not less than that, because the changes in the so-called existed order, okay, actually created a sort of a chaotic order, which is in a transition process toward a new type of order, which is not known yet, okay? And the process is such a bleeding process, and I think that there is a sort of a strategic embarrassment among the local actors as well as among the regional and the international actors. And therefore, I think that such processes, which are socio-political processes in their nature, in their essence, are very long. They are bleeding processes, and before the situation will be stabilized or will be better, it will be much worse.
Final word?
One of the problems is also of the US is that now the whole focus is just on ISIS, and we are ignoring other problems. So if the situation like this continues, what we're going to see in Iraq is more problems of Shia militias with the Kurds, but also in Syria is that this empowers Shia militias there. So the sectarian conflict is going to worsen, and we're going to see more non-state actors waging violence against each other. And the problem is not just ISIS, the problem is that we need to have a regional solution and also an internal political solution for Iraq and Syria. Because one of the problems of the US and Iraq is that they didn't focus on solving the problems when they left Iraq. And when the US left, immediately the sectarian problems came back. So there needs to be a more long-term solution to these problems.
Yeah, just to add more uplifting notes to this description, I think, and that's only part of what we're looking at. On the other hand, we haven't shifted our attention on North Africa, and that could be, and that should be an entire other discussion in the sense that things are moving very dynamic in the Levant through Syria, which is this watershed event, but at the same time, Libya is another magnet of instability. Things are happening there that are going to also have a very important effect on North Africa and on the Sahel region. And to the last note is, however, things are dynamics on both directions, meaning we're focusing on the rise of non-state actors, state fragility, very uneasy and fragmented and contested processes of transitions, but in certain countries they also are leading to improvement and political reforms, and we shouldn't just think about Libya, we should also remember Tunisia and its step forwards. In other words, it's not all doom and gloom.
2 words.
Agree with your optimism. Most of the trends are negative, but this is not inevitable. We've seen bad situations before where the international order has come together and put us in a better place, and that's still possible.
All right, optimistic note. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Ambassador Jeffrey, Mr. Kinikiloglu, Professor Tzabar, Dr. Michael, Dr. Berti, and Mr. Van Wengelpool. Thank you very much.